which has been difficult for our translators, interpreters. So thank you all for your anticipated cooperation. And just a reminder to wait till I, as chair, recognize you, and a reminder that comments be addressed to the chair. So this is the start of our study on the defense of space, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. Lieutenant General Blaise Frawley, Deputy Commander, North American Aerospace Defense Command, and Brigadier General Michael Adamson, Commander 3 Canadian Space Division. So welcome both Generals Frawley and Adamson, and invite whomever is going to make the opening 5-minute statement, and look forward to what you have to say, and then we'll go to our rounds of questions. So, is it General Adamson? Please, 5 minutes, sir.
Certainly. Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Je suis le Brigadier Général Mike Adamson, commandant de la...
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant General Blaise.
I'm responsible for the administrative functions of the division, which includes the generation and development of personnel, strategic engagements with international allies and domestic partners, and identifying the operational capability deficiencies and needs. As the Joint Force Space Component Commander, I am responsible for the delivery and use of space capability to support Canadian Armed Forces operations at home and abroad. Space in the CAF has been evolving for over 20 years, with its first iteration, Director of Space Development, formed in 1997. 3 Canadian Space Division was established on the 22nd of July, 2022, representing the operationalization of the space domain within the CAF. This reorganization has streamlined how we meet our mandate, supporting CAF operations with space effects, maintaining space domain awareness, and defending and protecting military space capabilities. 3 Canadian Space Division is focused on the administrative business of the division, as well as developing and maintaining partnerships with our national and international space allies. 7 Wing was also stood up subordinate to 3 Canadian Space Division. They are primarily focused on planning and coordinating the actual delivery of these space effects. The space domain is also, as you can imagine, constantly evolving and changing. The growing accessibility of space means it is no longer limited to state players. Rather, we have seen incredible growth in civil and commercial activity and nefarious capability development by disruptive actors. This creates challenges as the space environment is becoming more congested, contested, and competitive, making it an increasingly difficult environment in which to operate. It also increases the vulnerability of critical capabilities, potentially affecting the long-term sustainability of space-based services. That is why Canada is working with other like-minded spacefaring nations to advance the development of responsible behaviors and to identify how to reduce the risks of misunderstanding and miscalculations in the space domain. As such, my priorities for the division are clear. 1, maintain relevance within Space Alliance frameworks. 2, maintain assured access to the space domain to support CAF operations at home and abroad. And 3, the continued evolution of the Space Division and the CAF Space Operations Enterprise. Since our establishment, 3 Canadian Space Division has been focused on increasing what I have dubbed the space-mindedness within the CAF. That is the mindset that acknowledges the critical dependency that every CAF operation and activity has on space. L'espace revêt une importance tout aussi vitale.
Space is just as vital to the day-to-day activities of Canadians. Space services power the stock market, provide intranet and cell phone services, get emergency services to where they're needed, and even deliver meals to our doorsteps. Part of my role is to ensure that space remains accessible and peaceful for the benefit of all, so that Canadians can continue to enjoy the services we rely on.
Invitation to speak to you today and the opportunity to build space-mindedness within the Canadian public, and I welcome your questions about space and defense. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
Thank you. And this February...
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. I apologize. Please, 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Lieutenant General Blaise Frawley, Deputy Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, which is headquartered in Colorado Springs. As Deputy Commander of NORAD, my role is to support General Gregory Guillot, Commander of NORAD, in the execution of our binational command's missions, namely aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning.
Within aerospace warning and aerospace control, NORAD relies on space-based capabilities every day for providing threat warning and attack assessment, communication, navigation, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, weather tracking, and much more. There is nothing we do as a joint binational partner command that is not enabled or enhanced by space power. While NORAD is not responsible for space defense, General Guillot has expressed that awareness and protection of the space domain is absolutely critical. As modern threats continue to blur the lines between air and space, it is now more important than ever that Canada and the U.S. work collaboratively in both domains, such as we're doing with the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar Initiative, to defend North America and better integrate space-mindedness into our operational environment. Thank you, merci, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to address this committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
Thank you. This February, the U.S. House Intelligence Committee Chairman, Republican Mike Turner, disclosed a new threat by Russia to deploy a new anti-satellite weapon. How imminent is this new threat?
Mr. Speaker, thanks very much. It's a great question and certainly an issue that concerns us significantly. We are working with the American Space Force and Space Command in order to understand what that threat might be and understand what implications that might pose to activities in the domain. We don't believe at the moment that there is any imminent threat, but certainly as we look with the Americans and our allies to understand what might be going on, that's certainly something that in due course would be communicated to those that would be implicated.
Okay, so it was indicated that the new weapon developed by Russia may utilize nuclear weapons to destroy satellites. How credible is it at this point that that is feasible to do in the near future?
I think as a feasibility, certainly it is a possibility, but I don't think that we're able to conclusively determine at this point that that is in fact what the nature of the weapon might be.
If Russia were to use nuclear bombs in space, what are the consequences if they were to detonate a nuclear device in low Earth orbit? Could you?
Certainly a great question and one that we're trying to understand ourselves. We've seen in the past, in the 50s and 60s, there were tests that were done with these kinds of weapons in space, which provided, I think, a bit of a benchmark in case something like that was to occur again. It's probably worth stating as well that international law prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in space, so this would be a direct violation of that and certainly counter to accepted norms of behavior that we would expect from any spacefaring nation. The impact and implications of something like that, I think, would be considerable in terms of what it might do to pollute the environment, how it might directly affect satellites that were sort of in the near vicinity of such a blast, and certainly it would be cause for concern that we might in fact lose some of the utility of some of those satellites if they're not appropriately hardened.
And impact on Earth?
It really depends on the altitude at which something like that would happen, but I don't think that we would expect there would be a direct impact on Earth.
Okay, so according to a leaked U.S. intelligence report, China is building a sophisticated cyber weapon, or more than one, to seize control of enemy satellites, rendering them useless for data signals or surveillance during wartime. How prepared is Canada to deal with this, and what is the financial allocation out of this budget to work towards getting our assets hardened?
Another great question. That really speaks to equities and expertise of my colleague on the Joint Force Cyber Component Command. That's certainly within their wheelhouse to understand that threat and how we might counter that. Certainly from our perspective, it is a concern. The space infrastructure that we concern ourselves with consists of activities or platforms of vehicles that are on orbit in space, obviously ground infrastructure that would be a concern, and then the link between the two, that the communication signal between those two, all of which are potential avenues for our adversaries to try and affect what it is that we're doing and degrade our capabilities. Any further than that, though, on the cyber front, I would have to defer to my cyber colleagues.
Okay, within the last several months, there was a satellite by China that came very close to one of our North American defense satellites. It was eclipsing our satellite for a while. Is there any indication that that Chinese satellite obtained any information or changed any of the coordinates or did anything to the North American defense satellite?
At this point, I would say that there's no indication that it caused us to change or would cause our allies to change anything that they're doing on orbit. Certainly, we watch that with great interest, and the ability to understand that kind of activity on orbit speaks to the criticality of space domain awareness and how important it is that we, either through our own contributions and also then being plugged into wider allied efforts, are able to understand who's doing what on orbit, if a satellite, for instance, is approaching one of our own, and being able to attribute those actions to whoever might be responsible for doing that activity.
Okay, so they're also saying that in the United States, the Intelligence Committee, that the nuclear weapons could be launched in space by placing the weapon into orbit. Is that possible right now? Do we know that it's not currently in place?
We've not seen that at this point, so I don't believe that that is something we're concerned with. Is it theoretically possible? Potentially at some point down the road, but not something that we're dealing with at the moment.
Okay, so back to the Chinese communist-owned satellites. What, if anything, do they have to do with these balloons, and have you had any more sightings or experiences with any of these balloons that were such a concern a number of months ago?
Speaker, I'll defer to my NORAD colleague.
Yeah, so as far as a link between the satellites and balloons, we at the unclassified level have not seen any link between the two, other than the fact that a balloon flying over North America could be collecting surveillance data. Talking about balloons, there are thousands of balloons that fly over North America every year.
But we're concerned about the ones that could be detrimental to our national security.
Absolutely. So when we have an unknown track and we think it might be a balloon, we first of all have to identify it as such, which is challenging given our domain awareness issues. In other words, our radar coverage does not go out far enough out over our coast and over northern Canada. Once we've identified what it is, we have to determine, is it a threat to North America? We haven't seen a similar type threat since February of last year, but we do assess every single balloon.
We're going to have to
Has
leave
your
that.
equipment improved at all so that you can detect more?
You'll have to work your answer back in on something else. Thanks, Ms. Gallant. Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Generals, thank you very much for making time to be with us today and for your service and that of your team that is with you as well. This is the first time the Standing Committee on National Defense has engaged on the topic of space. And so there is a lot that we don't know. I don't think there's anyone around this table that would in any respect call themselves an expert. So I think that we're all kind of very cognizant that there's a lot we don't know, and I'm really looking forward to this exercise today and over the coming weeks of the study for us to understand those things that we don't know and need to understand better. The kind of way that we've framed the study is trying to get an understanding of how the role of space in national security and sovereignty, the role of space in how we fulfill our international obligations with international partners, and then the role for Canadian technology and industry to maintain that Canada remains a leader. And I'm hoping that today we can cover all those things, maybe not in the 6 minutes, but maybe I could start then with the last item I mentioned. We're seeing increasingly that the private sector is being turned to get things into space. Right now, Canada doesn't have a domestic launch capability. We're working hard on that at maritime launch. But this brings up the question of collaboration and cooperation and even interdependence on international partners. I wonder if you could talk about the role of the private sector in Canada and elsewhere in the world on achieving our space objectives.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, this is a great question, and it's an initiative that we've seen advance not just in Canada, but certainly amongst our allies over the last couple of years. As previous commander of U.S. Space Force was fond of saying, space is hard. It's resource intensive, it's expensive, it takes a lot in order to field all of the capabilities that one would want in order to conduct space operations. As we look at that and the intricacies of space domain operations, it's become very clear to us and our allies over the last little while that this really needs to be a large team effort in terms of not just having defense capabilities, but certainly leveraging those of industry partners. We've seen that in current conflict environments where you've got industry providing information or assisting certainly in the collecting of information, if you will. But what we've done is, in order to recognize that and make sure that we're able to work collaboratively with our industry partners, is we're standing up something called a commercial integration cell within our own Canadian Space Operations Center. This is mirroring the intent behind what we've seen in the U.S., where they have over a dozen companies that are part and parcel of that integration cell. It's something that we've worked through Interchange Canada to make sure that this is purely an ability for us to be able to speak at a classified level with industry partners to talk about what's going on in the domain, but separates any potential future projects or procurement or anything from that, so that we can sort of keep that compartmentalized. As we leverage industry and commercial capabilities, it's going to be really important for us to have that conversation and that dialogue at appropriate security classification levels. So it is certainly a change that we've seen in the paradigm of delivering space defense effects, and certainly, like I said, something that all of our allies are working on as we sort of collectively look at how we do this, with partners in industry and defense and allies internationally.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
please.
Running on in your 5 minutes, Mr. Chair. So I'm in town for this, but also for a NORAD summit. This is a first-time ever NORAD summit. Our program within NORAD called STURDY, that's Science, Technology, R&D, and Innovation, annually brings in industry to Colorado Springs. And this is the first time we're actually doing it in Canada to encourage Canadian industry. We outline the challenges of the future, looking out 15, 20, 25 years for NORAD, and industry comes up with solutions. So you understand there's NORAD modernization, which is the Canadian project, but the modernization of NORAD is a long, continual thing that will continue into the future. And so we want to make sure that we not only include Canadian industry, but are there space capabilities that could help us with our future problems in the NORAD context?
Okay, thank you. Brigadier General, you mentioned leveraging the private sector to achieve our objectives, and it touches on what the Lieutenant General said as well. The result of this study will be recommendations to government. This would be a really good opportunity to let the committee know, and therefore let government know what we might do better or differently to make sure that we're able to leverage the private sector, to position the private sector in Canada, the domestic technology sector in Canada, for that kind of support role and commercial success as well. Do you have any reflections on that?
Certainly, yeah, Mr. Speaker. This is a great question, and one that, again, we've been looking at over the last little while. When we look at the adversarial challenges that are out there, and we often refer to China as the pacing threat, trying to keep pace with that can be a challenge, and certainly probably the best organizations that are positioned to be able to move innovation and technological development quickly are going to be our industry partners. I think what we need to do is we need to be consultative with industry to understand what new technology they may be working on and where we might be able to utilize that for best effect. But certainly it's got to be a collaborative and consultative engagement that we have with industry as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. Please.
If I may, Mr. Chair. So one of the things that we run into the most when we hold our STURDY symposiums is classification levels. So when we talk the future of NORAD, we're talking at least at the secret level, if not at the TS level. U.S. companies, they take an effort, make an effort so that their companies have folks that are cleared right up to that level. Canadian companies, not as much. So they get excluded from the discussions that have to be at those levels. So if there's one thing I could change, it would be to encourage Canadian industry to obtain the classification level so we can have the discussion with them and we can include them.
To the planning and so
Absolutely.
forth. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Billmore. I think we have our first recommendation. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci
Madame
beaucoup.
Normandie will speak en français.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presence here today. I'd like to get back to one of the first things you said, Brigadier General Adamson. You mentioned that one of your roles was to identify operational deficiencies in the forces when it comes to space. Can you tell us about those deficiencies to start? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I'll be answering in English because it's quite technical.
The identifying, that's one of the roles that we set out for the 3rd Canadian Space Division when we stood it up. There was no operational authority within the Canadian Armed Forces up until that point to look at that. And really, we talk to our allies. We take a frank look at the adversarial threat that is out there, and almost on a daily basis, we learn something that we didn't know to begin with that will speak to what we should be doing from a capability development perspective. The nature of the threats, the nature of activities in the domain change on a regular, daily, weekly basis, and certainly we need to be, I think, agile in terms of how we look at that. In terms of looking at capabilities we may not have now and ones that we might want to look at going forward, we have to do this in a holistic sense. We do something we call allied by design in terms of addressing how all of our allies work together to deliver space effects. We work very closely, obviously, with the Americans, with Australia, with the UK, and others. It's no point in us building something that already exists. I think we have to have a complementarity in our capability development efforts in order for us to be bringing something relevant to the table and being of value to our allies. And that's basically shaping the way that we're going forward and recognizing what we need to do next.
Merci. Mais justement, pour aller plus loin dans...
Thank you. To actually discuss this issue a bit further, what you've done, what would be the weaknesses that have been identified and that you're working on right now?
I don't know that I would, thanks very much for the question, merci beaucoup. I don't know that I would characterize them as weaknesses at the moment as opposed to understanding the threat environment. What we've seen over the last little while is a significant level of effort and development on the part of our adversaries to deny us the ability to be able to conduct operations in the space domain. Everything we do, whether it's aircraft or ships or tanks or a soldier walking through the woods, relies on some kind of space-enabled capability, whether that be a GPS, whether that be satellite communications or what have you. And our allies are looking to make sure that we maintain assured access to those things so that we can use them. Our adversaries understand that that is something that they would want to rob us of in order to then give themselves the upper hand. It becomes interesting when we go, well, that same GPS signal that is helping us formulate our plans to conduct military operations is the same one that's in your car that is getting you to the grocery store or getting the first responders to the heart attack victim or what have you. The same satellite communications that they would deny are the same ones that we rely on societally on a daily basis as well. So certainly there's added interest and impetus for us to be able to address those things.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get back to Madame Gallant's question about the nuclear aspect in space. There is work ongoing at the United Nations to prevent the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. I'm wondering if when it comes to space, there is something that is similar to deterrence that we would have on land for any nuclear threat. Is this a concept that exists? And if so, what does that mean exactly?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Deterrence is it's a whole of government effort, and something like this is going to rely on a number of different departmental entities and stakeholders to be able to deter the adversary. Obviously, the impacts to something like this would not be felt just militarily, but they would have impacts to society in terms of our ability to access these services that I've just spoken about. But the deterrence component will come from Global Affairs Canada, it will come through sanctions, it will come through diplomatic means, démarches, and what have you. And certainly I can't speak at great length about that. The other deterrence is the fact that militarily, we want to our adversaries to understand that it's not ever going to be in their best interest to do something like that. The best way for us to deter adversaries is to maintain a strong, united front with our allies. When they look across the table and they see that we are part of a team, that is, I think, the strength in our deterrence capability. Our adversaries don't necessarily have friends and colleagues like we do in the West, whether that be through alliance frameworks or what have you. And really, it's important to maintain, I think, a strong and collaborative front in that regard to deter those kinds of activities.
Merci. Peut-être une question.
Thank you. A quick question. Space debris is an issue. We've heard a number of things like you'd need a laser or something to get rid of this debris. But realistically, what is being considered to address this issue of waste in space?
Okay, well, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Is interesting. I think what we're going to have to see going forward is legislation globally, internationally, on norms of behavior that would state if you're going to launch a rocket into space, that it would be, behoove those launching parties to deorbit rocket bodies responsibly. If you have a satellite in space and it's going to reach end of life, make sure that you keep enough fuel on board to deorbit or to be able to dispose of it. At the same time, there's going to be, I think, business opportunities for folks out there or companies that come up with a great way of being able to either capture or dispose of debris in their own way. I've seen lots of sort of innovative ideas out there, from butterfly nets to lasers and everything in between. Debris is certainly a problem, and I think we're probably going to be hard-pressed to negate some of the debris or a lot of the debris that is out there. It's going to be in our best interest to make sure that we don't add to that problem going forward, and that's internationally.
Merci.
Normandy, Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for appearing before us today. When the Canadian Space Division was first announced in 2022, you actually had informed the media that you wanted to reach that personnel level dedicated to the division of 270 CAF members. Now, we've seen a lot of there's been a ton of focus, of course, as it rightfully so, on recruitment retention issues within the CAF. And that other division that we're speaking about and building up, of course, is that cyber force. So we've been hearing in this committee a lot about all of the things that CAF need in order to be the strong force that they need to be. So that's appropriate housing, affordable housing, reasonable cost of living, you name it. As these responsibilities and those worries grow on CAF personnel related to all the things that I know that the general population in Canada also worry about, can you talk about getting to that 270 mark, how you've done it, how you want to continue to do it, and what personnel needs to see in your division to get to that 270 mark?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. So there are some elements of the question that I think I would best defer to our Military Personnel Command in terms of looking at things like housing and benefits and recruitment and retention issues that are squarely within their lanes, and they've certainly got a lot of effort going into programs to try and address all of those. From a Space Division perspective, we are growing towards that 270 goal. We are unique insofar as none of the folks that are working in the Space Division are coming directly off the street. So this isn't a recruiting issue. We typically take personnel that are already in the Canadian Armed Forces, Army, Air Force, and Navy. We are joint. And we bring them in. We will teach them what they need to know to be space operators. We'll retain them for the normal tour length, 3 or 4 years. And then they'll normally go back to wherever they came from, with the idea that at some point we'd bring that expertise back at the next rank level and they would be future space leaders. So I'm not worried about recruiting off the street in that regard. And certainly if we were to look around the Canadian Armed Forces to find people that may be interested in coming to us, that is the number one question I get when I speak at town halls is, how do I get into the space organization? It's absolutely fascinating for folks, and there's no shortage of potential applicants. To that end, I am blessed with the fact that I have a workforce that is absolutely thrilled about doing what they do, and to walk around the spaces for both 7 Wing and the division and run into people that are passionate about space and delivering those effects is really heartwarming for us. Yeah.
That retention piece, though, so maybe not recruitment, but retention certainly is an issue, and that competition that we see, of course, with the private sector. Can you speak to that and the issues that you're having on that end?
Yeah, great question. From our perspective, I don't see the retention issues within the Space Division, like I said, simply because I've got a highly motivated and highly enthusiastic workforce. Beyond that, in the larger CAF, again, that would probably be a question that would be better be posed to our Personnel Command folks.
Okay. One of the issues, of course, that we're also hearing a lot about in a re-examination, I think this comes up a lot, is that universality of service. Is there a potential to re-examine that and see that as a movement in terms of bringing people into that very exciting role and jobs that you have available in Space Division and maybe the elimination potentially of that universality, to open that more to people who don't want to leave CAF and want that exciting repost?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, that's a great question. I think it probably wouldn't come as a surprise to understand that most of space operations are done at a desk, at a console, in an operations center, as opposed to deploying perhaps in harsher environments where universality of service is a factor. It's probably worth noting as well that close to 50% of the Space Division at the moment is civilian personnel as well, which aren't obviously subject to universality of service concerns. And it's something that, we are well aware of the fact that if there are folks that have got restrictions on the universality of service, we are welcoming as long as they can do the job that we need them to do and be able to meet those requirements. There is an element of deployability with some of our folks. There is a possibility that we may deploy space support teams into the field to support deployed commanders, but for the most part, our work is done, locally within the headquarters environment, and certainly one we'd be able to accommodate certainly those U of S concerns.
Okay. We spoke, Mr. Fillmore was asking a lot about that private side, the commercial side, how we support Canadian industry, and it's good that we move in that way. It's certainly something burgeoning and something that we do need to work more on. Currently, the Americans, they have built a network of hundreds of spy satellites, but through Elon Musk's company. I know that I have a lot of questions about that partnership, considering our allyship and our extreme twined role with the United States. How reliant are we upon a company like SpaceX, for example, for our capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I would probably not characterize any of the SpaceX capabilities as spy satellites. They are really communication satellites that are designed to provide high bandwidth communications to a consumer customer. Now, I know that in the interests of understanding how that might work in a military context, there has been use of Starlink capabilities on the U.S. side to better understand whether or not that would serve a need for more communications. I don't think we can ever have too many communications capabilities in a military context. But as for our reliance on it, and from a Canadian perspective, we're not reliant at all on anything like SpaceX or Starlink for conducting any of our business, which isn't to say at some point we might not want to use SpaceX or another commercial provider for satellite communications in addition to military satellite communications.
Okay, we're going to have
but that would be the same as using the internet. So.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you. So, General Frawley, in response to Mrs. Gallant's question about domain awareness, actually her question about the possibility of further incursions into Canadian airspace, such as what we saw in the early months of 2023, you said that our radar coverage is insufficient to detect these kinds of threats, or at least all of these kinds of threats. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So, this has been identified numerous years. Our commander makes a report to both the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of the Defense Staff, highlighting that we have issues with domain awareness when it comes to our radar coverage. So if you look out beyond our coasts, both east, west, and in the north, once you get a distance off the coast, we have no radar coverage. In northern Canada, central northern Canada especially, if you look at a map of where everybody lives in northern Canada, where there's very few people, there's very little to no radar coverage, including communication coverage. That, again, has been identified, and that's why we are moving forward with over-the-horizon radar to solve that problem, covering those areas that are currently not covered.
Okay, so what's the delivery date of an over-the-horizon system that will correct all of these shortcomings?
Okay, so I can speak to over-the-horizon. It's OTHR Arctic, which is one of 2 Canadian radars that will be fielded by 2026. The polar variant, which will be situated further north in Canada, which will look over the poles. I don't have a date on that, but it's a number of years later. There's still a certain amount of R&D going on to figure out how to bounce off of the polar atmosphere. And the U.S. are in line with similar timelines, 2026, for their radars for the coasts.
Okay, so in 2022, the Auditor General reported that it will take a decade for the Canadian Space Agency to launch a successor to RadarSat, and that an interruption in satellite Earth observation services past 2026 is a significant risk. When will we have a successor to RadarSat?
Talk about that.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. So we have been leveraging RadarSat 2 for a number of years to provide synthetic aperture radar intelligence gathering or information gathering, if you will, overlaid with automated identification of shipping to look at the approaches to North America. RadarSat-2 then begat RadarSat Constellation mission, which we worked very closely with the Canadian Space Agency in order to deliver those effects. I believe it was just last year, if I'm not mistaken, where there was an announcement for the CSA, a funding announcement in order to extend the lifespan of RCM. And I understand my CSA colleagues are following us today, so I'll let them talk about how RadarSat Constellation mission will be extended going into the future. Beyond that, we do have a program of record, Defense Enhanced Surveillance from Space, which will provide synthetic aperture radar, as we've seen now with AIS data, and then potentially other onboard sensors as well to contribute to our understanding of what's going on around the globe. Delivery timelines at the moment, I believe, are probably mid-2030s.
If I may go back to General Frawley, if RadarSat fails in 2026, as is the expectation built into the lifespan of that system, how does that affect North American air defense?
Mr. Chair, so we use RadarSat Constellation mission primarily for maritime warning, the third mission that I mentioned. It's not the only source of data. Clearly, there's RCM, and there's other data available. So it's blended in with significant other ISR data from other platforms to give us our maritime warning picture.
Okay, and you're gonna defer to our next panel on the expectation of replacement on that. You don't know when a RadarSat replacement will be ready.
RadarSat Constellation mission, the three satellites I don't have any information on that, Mr. Chair.
All right. Well, do we have what of the capacity for? Is there capacity within the private sector to provide the information that we are waiting? Is there anything off the shelf that can be quickly procured for replacement of this system or to replace the capability of the system?
Quickly procured and quickly answered.
Very quickly then, certainly, Mr. Chair, yes, I fully expect that there would be some kind of civil or commercial capability that would be available for us in order to leverage.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. So I guess based on the conversation that we're having, it seems like we don't know much because it's a domain that we don't have very much research on, and just in general, we rely very heavily on our allies in order to have a united front to protect ourselves. What are some of the challenges, barriers specifically when it comes to emerging to an emerging domain such as this? What are specifically the barriers that we have in front of us, and are there any strategies in place to make sure that we get to where we need to be in order to be effective?
Great question, Mr. Chair, and certainly I would characterize not necessarily barriers, but things that we're working on, things that we need to make sure that we better understand would be space domain awareness would be a classic example of that. Understanding what's going on orbit, understanding what our adversaries, what other companies are up to. The domain is getting increasingly congested. There are far more actors in space than there used to be. It's not just nation states that have the ability to do this now, but a significant number of commercial actors that are out there. A lot of activity, and certainly understanding what's going on, being able to prevent collisions or potential impacts out there. So space domain awareness is probably one of the larger challenges that we're dealing with at the moment. We do this, or we maintain this awareness through a number of fronts. We have Canada's satellite Sapphire, which contributes to the space surveillance network in the U.S. For the amount of goodness we put Sapphire in, that contributes to the larger database, and then we get all sorts of great information out in terms of global awareness of what's going on. We're also part of an organization called Joint Commercial Operations, which is almost like crowdfunding space domain awareness. It leverages a number of satellite observation stations on the globe, radars, whether they be academia, commercial companies, industry, and all of those companies subscribe into the central database. They put all of their information in there. It's unclassified, and basically we collate all of that as one of the partnering nations and are able to use that information as well to better understand what's going on in the domain as well. It is a challenge, and certainly I don't think we'll ever say that we have too much ability to understand what's going on in the domain, but certainly from a Canadian perspective, it's these international efforts and collaboration that allow us to maintain shared awareness.
Thank you. I actually I appreciate the fact that you brought up commercial actors. I know that Canada has an aerospace industry that is quite strong. Is there a way that, I know Ms. Matheson also raised this, but is there a specific way that we can, I guess, get them involved in a strategy that isn't just about data and sharing data, but actually creating equipment that could eventually help us get to a better place?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, a great question, and I think it goes back to some of the comments that General Frawley made earlier as well. We absolutely would love to collaborate more with industry and commercial entities in understanding what's going on, delivering space effects, and like I said, protecting our access to it in the face of potential adversarial actions. But that requires us to be able to have frank and at times classified discussions with our industry partners. It's something that we need to work on, that we can do better here in Canada, I think, in making sure that we're able to have those discussions with industry.
Thank you. And to bring it to a different place, I know you touched on it a little bit once again, but what do you think an increase in launch schedules from China and Russia could potentially mean for Canada? What are does it place us at a greater risk, or is there a threat to Canada? What do you think of those?
I think that we've seen a huge increase in launch pace over the last few years, going from maybe 100 to hundreds of launches per year. Each one of those launches potentially putting 50, 60 satellites at a time in orbit. That increased pace of launch has both an upside and a downside. There's an increased pace of launch because it's less expensive now, so there's a lot of opportunity there for commercial and industry partners to be able to take advantage of that. Conversely, though, if it's some of our adversaries, we don't know what they're launching necessarily. So, understanding what they've launched, where they've launched, what orbit it goes into, and then when it gets up there, what is it doing? These are questions that we ask ourselves and work very hard to try and understand, because not all of that is necessarily for peaceful or academic or scientific use. There are, of course, activities that are nefarious in nature, and we need to be able to attribute those activities. So the challenge in that regard is, like I said earlier, space domain awareness, understanding what's happening in the domain.
Okay.
And I just joined Mr. Fillmore and Ms. Lambropoulos. We're trying to up the knowledge base of the committee, and I appreciate that occasionally we'll lapse into acronyms. So if you could just catch yourselves and disaggregate the acronyms for those of us who don't deal with this on a daily basis. Thank you. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There are a number of countries that are, shall we say, non-allied, who are interested in space for commercial reasons and also scientific reasons, and sometimes they hide some military purposes behind those other more acceptable purposes. I'm thinking of China, for instance. How can we militarily validate the scientific and other projects from these countries that are not like-minded, and make sure that we're not actually missing out on something that is hidden behind that veneer, if you will?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, when we talk about China, we don't have much information on China, not as much as we have on other countries. That's a part of the problem. And when we talk about their intentions in space, I would look at their intentions in the Arctic in order to draw a link there. Every year we see some activity of a ship that is a supposedly scientific ship, according to China, that is close to our waters and our waters. If we, I think, draw links between that kind of activity on the part of China and what's happening in space, it's not quite clear what China is doing in space in that domain.
Absolument, c'est correct.
That's correct.
Not going to tell us what it is that they're doing. They're not going to advertise, hey, this is a satellite or this is a capability that we're using for this purpose. And even when they may hint at that, the fact of the matter is we basically enter that with a suspicion that whatever is going on is probably at least dual purpose in nature. If it is an academic or scientific purpose, that it probably has some kind of military or intelligence gathering capability as well, because I don't think you can clearly differentiate between the two and compartmentalize those within the Chinese context. So to that end, all we really can do is continue to watch, better understand, and try and infer from their activities and their actions what's going on.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Madsen.
Thank you. Just sort of to build off, I guess, of where we were talking before, but certainly in terms of that private side, in terms of our arms trade, arms trades treaties, I wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about China. We've talked a bit about that, but what about the other players around the world? Could you expand more on North Korea, Iran, not Iran, but India? Canada does a lot of trade with countries like Israel in terms of space domain. We've now put forward a motion to really heighten our arms trade controls and those arms trade treaties. Can you speak to that and what that means in terms of space and those other players on the world front in like 2 minutes?
Merci, bonne great question. I'm not sure that I can speak to a lot of that. At the moment, where we're concentrating our efforts from the Space Division standpoint is working with our allies, closely to understand the sort of near and present threats from a military perspective. So that would, the obvious answers to that would be China, and Russia would be the other one. And we haven't talked a lot about Russia. Russia's really a space power in decline. They continue to launch, but not nearly at the rate that they would have in the past, and certainly not a rate that I think they would continue to enjoy. I think that the sanctions and the activities, the illegal conflict in Ukraine are having adverse effects on their abilities to be able to do all of that. And certainly they're losing commercial customers in terms of launch because of their activities in that regard. So I think, from our perspective, we watch them carefully. They continue to field significant capabilities to deny us use of the domain, but we don't see them using the domain in nearly the same way or nearly as reliant as we have been.
30 seconds? Okay. So I mentioned Israel. You didn't respond. Do we share satellite space intelligence with them? And are they applicable to that arms trade treaty? How do we navigate that?
That I can't speak to. The CF Intelligence Command is the organization with the Canadian Armed Forces that does any work in that regard. That's not something that we work in at all. Thanks.
Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both our witnesses for being here. Good seeing you again, General Frawley. It's always great to have NORAD at the table, and General Amundsen, welcome to committee. Just to drill down more on the nuclear weaponization of space. The U.S., I know back in the 60s, did a number of nuclear tests, I think 5 under Operation Fishbowl. Knowing the impact back then, if the Russians decided to target satellites, how big a blast area are we potentially talking about, and how many communication satellites and other satellites that we have in space would be impacted at the various levels? Has anybody done that analysis, and especially...
Mr. Chair, that's a great question. There are a lot of variables in that, in the answer. It would really depend on the size of the weapon. So that would be obviously something we would be interested to understand if this was in fact a reality. Where on orbit it would be then detonated is also a concern. Low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geostationary, or somewhere in between would certainly affect the blast pattern, the blast radius, if you will. Whether or not then those effects would reach across various orbital domains would also be something we'd be interested to try and understand. And then the long-term effects of that, obviously, there would be probably destructive effects with those satellite vehicles that would be in the direct line of sight of such a blast. The follow-on concern then becomes then the radiated space that is now existing afterwards that, again, depending on the orbital domain, other satellites might be going through then over the next period of time, whether that be hours, days, weeks, or what have you. The expectation is that that would have a deleterious effect, whether that would result in the destruction of those satellites, a reduced lifespan, or no effect at all remains to be seen. Certainly when those tests were done in the 60s, there wasn't nearly the on-orbit activity that we have now, so it would be kind of hard to assess that at the moment.
Okay, I appreciate that. But my understanding is that when one of those tests in particular, that over a third of the satellites that were in orbit at that time were impacted because of both the after effect plus the immediate blast. And you look at the exponential growth in satellites that are currently in our space, it would have a much greater impact and impact the way we do business. Like everybody relies on satellite communication. So speaking about that satellite communication, we talk about NORAD modernization. We talk about the F-35s coming online. DPU talks about having early warning aircraft and command, AWACS. What do we need in space to enable those platforms to do the NORAD mission, particularly in the Arctic?
Our Chairman, thanks for the question. So obviously, anything linked to ISR is critical for us. So anything linked to especially polar over-the-horizon radar, given where it's going to be, it'll communicate through SATCOM to get its information back to our headquarters. Certainly, communications SATCOM-wise, as I said earlier, we have huge gaping communication holes over northern Canada and clearly over the Arctic. If we're going to reach out and touch the Russian bombers before they launch their cruise missiles, which is our goal, then we're going to have to be able to get a long way north, and so we need communications that cover over the entirety of the northern pole.
And I appreciate that because I've seen the map where we actually have our North Warning System and how the entire interior of northern Canada and the entire Arctic archipelagos, with the exception of Alert and maybe Resolute Bay, are completely bare naked. Like there is no surveillance there at all. So the over-horizon radar is important. But also, what about LEOs, low Earth orbit satellites, to help inform our early warning system as well? Is that something that NORAD's looking at? Is that something that's a part of the intelligence gathering that Space Command's are going to be needing?
So what I can say from, Mr. Chairman, from a NORAD perspective is NORAD doesn't do space. We rely on space. So we describe what our requirements are, and then on the U.S. side, U.S. Spacecom and U.S. Space Force will determine what is the best way to deliver that. And on the Canadian side, it would be DG Air and Space Force Development. So again, we very clearly highlight what we need, where our shortcomings are, but we don't actually determine is it best suited to be LEO, GEO, highly elliptical, et cetera, et cetera. Over.
Razan. Final question, Mr. Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and Generals, welcome to the committee. General Adamson, I'll start with you in terms of the commercial integration cell. I want to follow up on Ms. Matheson's question that she asked earlier in terms of working with industry. You've highlighted the benefits, and I think some of them are very obvious in terms of it's an expensive process that we're involved in, and so relying on the private sector certainly helps us lower the cost, I would think, for some of these initiatives. And it also drives innovation, right, in terms of supporting industry, and we'll see benefits there. I am fascinated, though, with our increasing reliance on industry. There is the politics of industry itself. I'll raise the Starlink issue with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That was played out in a very public way. And so some in the public might say that an increasing reliance on the private sector or industry or for-profit organizations, there may arise in the future, and I'm not asking for your opinion on the Starlink situation, but there may be scenarios like that in the future where there's some question about security and partnerships, whether they're legal or not. How can the public be assured that we're protected with those agreements, knowing that there's an element of politics with some of these situations that arise?
Mr. Chair, that's a great question, and certainly an issue and a concern that we have lived with as we've looked at standing up our commercial integration cell, because obviously we want to make sure that there is no appearance of impropriety in dealing with a commercial company, such that their participation in this initiative would provide them some kind of undue advantage on a future project or procurement capability as well. And it's one that we've seen, like I said, our allies come to grips with as well. So you have to have, I think, very clear guardrails in place to make sure that you keep things appropriate. Certainly, I am much more beholden to policy advice in this position than I've ever been before, and I don't do anything without talking to my policy and JAG colleagues when we look at this. It's something that I think we're highly sensitive to, and something that is certainly looked at very closely as we go forward.
General Frawley, on that same issue?
Sorry.
Just in terms of private contracts that we have, there may be an element of politics in terms of positions that are held by corporations or individuals. And the public's assurance that with the increasing reliance on private industry, that the investments that we make will be protected in a time of conflict.
Yeah, so, I mean, on the NORAD side, we don't see near as much of that type of contracting, et cetera, as we do in other parts of the government and within the Department of National Defense. And most of that would be on the U.S. side as opposed to the Canadian side, which I'm not at liberty to talk about. So,
obviously, General Adamson, can I talk about the Wild West scenario that you talked about earlier in terms of with many issues, whether it's the space debris issue that was raised earlier, or some of the nuclear threats that were talked about, there really aren't a lot of structured international agreements at present that kind of talk about the rules of space. And knowing that we have some state actors who are unwilling to assist in that regard in terms of formulating those agreements, Russia, China being, I think, top of the list, how do we move forward with our allies in terms of creating some rules of order in an area where it is, I think, early days and still that Wild West scenario?
That's a great question, Mr. Chair. We, through a number of different organizations, but I'll highlight the Combined Space Operations Initiative, which currently, comprises of 10 nations, our Five Eyes partners, France, Germany, and then recently Italy, Norway, and Japan joined just before Christmas. It's a body that is represented by nations from around the world that are like-minded in terms of advocating for responsible behaviors, and certainly collectively we have the ability to be able to call out irresponsible behaviors on the parts of any nation, state, or even commercial actor that might be acting irresponsibly. What can we do other than obviously doing that collectively with the voice of a number of nation partners is maintain the moral high ground. I think from a Canadian perspective, certainly we need to take a look at how it is that we employ assets in space, how our own industry operates in space, and make sure that we're not doing anything that would call into question our responsible behaviors in that regard and set the example. And I know that our allies are like-minded in doing that as well.
Thank you, Mr. 20 seconds. Very quickly, the evolution of space division, you highlighted that in your opening. Can you talk about where we are 5 to 10 years from now, or where you hope we're at?
I think it's been an absolutely incredible journey these last couple of years. The space-mindedness of the Canadian Armed Forces has been increased. I think our joint force understands how important space is to everything that they're doing, but also, that they need to be sensitive to the fact that if that is degraded or denied to them, that they need to be able to work through it. So I think that educational piece is there. We will continue to do that over the next few years. We will continue to recognize capability areas that perhaps don't exist at the moment, but might become an issue or a concern. Space domain awareness will go beyond geostationary belt to cislunar space as we watch more and more missions heading out towards the moon, Mars, and potentially beyond. This space is the limit. It could be, who knows? I'll be interested to see myself.
Mr. Collins, and unfortunately, that brings our first hour to a close. This has been absolutely fascinating and a terrific start for the committee. Just before I let you get your well-deserved lunch, if NORAD detects some space threat that is such that it needs to be activated, is Canada entirely dependent upon the U.S. response to any threat about to be activated?
Okay, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So NORAD doesn't watch objects in space, what we do is we watch launches, terrestrial launches towards space. Of course, what we're watching for predominantly is ballistic missiles or missiles that could become hypersonic missiles. We also see all reentries. We do this through what's called OPIR, Overhead Persistent Infrared. It's a satellite system that essentially watches the Earth constantly. But watching objects in space is absolutely a U.S. Space Command responsibility and Space Operations Command. We're obviously concerned about anything that might have been in space for a period of time and could deorbit and then become a ballistic missile or a hypersonic weapon. So always watching for reentries, but again, not monitoring space specifically. U.S. Spacecom does that. And as do our the Canadians
Is
in the spot.